Hello, my name is John, and welcome to the first of many messages dealing with the book of John. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, for lending me your ear. Glad to have you. First things first, in case the heading of the first slide is not obvious, today we're going to take a look at something very special, the prologue, the introductory section of the fourth gospel, at least some aspects of it anyways. We're going to get our feet wet, and that's because I can't cover everything in one message because of how in depth and how long this segment is, which by the way consists of something like 18 verses. So I'll say up front that it's going to take a while to get through everything and unpack everything. All right. My intention then is to space out this coverage of this very immensely important section into several messages. Okay, then, with that explained, let's get right into it. Now, before looking at the text proper, the actual text of John's writing, the first 5 verses of chapter 1, there are a few basic points that I need to explain. Things that have to do with the culture, the history, and the literary forces that are at work in John's writing. And we need to do this because we need to understand more clearly what the gospel writer, the evangelist, the Apostle John, is trying to communicate to his audience, to his original intended audience. So with that in mind, here is some of the background behind the prologue of this immensely popular work. So please direct your attention to the left side of the screen. Point A on Greek influence. So first of all, it must be understood that John was a person, a real living person, and a person of his era, a person of his time. So remember, John is an ancient Palestinian of the early first century. He was a devout monotheistic Jewish man. He was probably young at the time when he met Jesus, right? And without a doubt, he was exposed to Jewish culture. He was a Jewish man. He grew up in that culture. But he was also living in a time period where Greek and Roman influences were everywhere, right? And this applies to the diaspora, or the dispersed Israelites that lived, here and there in Palestine, those who resided in that region so many years ago. So just like you and me, John was an individual, a malleable person, right? A person of his time period, a product of his era. So this means that the beloved disciple was exposed to much of Jewish thought and life, but also this means that he was exposed to the Gentile world itself, a cultural, a secular world that cherished, popularized things like ancient classical writings, dramas, plays, various philosophies, Stoics and Platonists come to mind. Religion is a huge one, myths, the imperial cult was a big thing. Various cults related to the pantheon, for example. And so this also applies to John's methodology, writing style, the way he writes, the content that appears in his writing, and even his literary outlook. So this is not to say that he was a syncretist, syncretism being, like a hodgepodge of everything, incorporating things like pagan sensibilities, interests, and values. We're not saying that, but what I'm trying to say is that John was aware of the various cultures at work in his life, in his era. And so he was aware of these issues and concerns, so he wrote these things, he wrote the gospel with these things in mind. For instance, when John uses the Greek word cosmos, this word can be translated simply as world into English. He is often referring to humanity, humans as a whole. but he uses this in the negative sense, even when applied to Israelites. So when he's talking about the world, he's talking about everyone, Israelites, Samaritans, and Gentiles, sinners, right? The people of this world, the people of darkness, of sin, and all the baggage that, is attached to that. So while cosmos can mean many things, depending on the context, John's usage is typically, as I just described, referring to a broken humanity associated with something dark, darkness. That word appears in the prologue. So again, because John, he's a person, he's an author, right? A biblical writer. He's a product of cultural influences. We cannot get away from that. We must accept this. And he was aware of various considerations, right? Which I just kind of talked about. And, this is reflective of, everything that his time, his people's, the things that they were aware of, the things that they were sensitive to, right? So prologues in the ancient world, they were common in writings and plays. These literary constructs, I guess you can call them that, these appear in the opening of many stories, types of stories, such as, say, like bibliographies, cults, myths, things that have to do with education, entertainment, all sorts of things that has to do with stories. And prologues, they existed as a means of introducing, these storytelling elements, things that were critical to telling the story. Basic elements such as introducing important characters, characters like the Father, the Son, John the Baptist, and so forth. The prologue was very important in establishing the settings, such as the primordial world at the time of creation, or the Palestine of John's time. Prologues were good and necessary for establishing worldviews and various presuppositions. Like, for instance, the God of Israel as being the one true monotheistic God, or the idea of ex nihilo, the idea that God created the world out of nothing. Okay. So in addition to these, broadly speaking, ideas and themes, they are everywhere in John, especially in John's prologue. These kinds of worldviews and presuppositions I spoke about. And, these include things like, say, the horrible state and condition of the world. The world as inexplicably fallen, the world as irreparably broken, the world that desperately needs restoration, Things like God's one and only Son, Jesus Christ. We can't get away from that. Jesus, who is unique. The Son, who is without equal, who is the Word which is pre-existent, eternal. And, Jesus, who is in closest proximity and is in a proper relationship with the Father. The will of God, the plans of God for his Son, for oppressed peoples, whether they're Israelite or Gentile, and God's will and plan for sinners, The prologue deals with that. Redemption is a big one, not only of those lost to sin, sinners, but a redemption of creation at large. This is especially applicable to John's apocalypse, aka Revelation. And of course, the testimony of witnesses to various truths, testimonies about God, humans, their relationships to each other, and the realities that they are a part of, the realities they are situated in, So all these things, they provide evidence, they provide legitimacy, validity, and value to the various truth claims and phenomena that appear in the book of John. So in short, the prologue, these it deals with many ideas and themes that explain and foreshadow things to come in the main narrative, you know. So that's why this beginning section to the gospel is so important. It is critical in our understanding for the rest of the book, because it provides the lens or the context through which we are to view and interpret the Gospel of John. Now, before examining the text proper of John's prologue in depth, I plan to do this across 3 or 4 messages. I need to go over some points about my own methodology. First of all, as you may be aware, I do my own biblical translation work. This is related to my own interests, but also because I have educational goals in mind. I want to be better at, understanding the Greek, understanding the Hebrew, and translation work helps to do that. But at the same time, there are copyright limitations, legal stuff. And so, although it's my desire to provide the original reconstructed Greek and Hebrew along with English translations, into the vernacular, I'm not able to do so without jumping through hoops. So, doing so is not practical nor feasible. So just keep that in mind. But because I want to be as transparent as possible, let me show you what translation work kind of looks like at a glance. Okay, for context, the top paragraph is a Bar Zebedee Project translation. It is the English translation I've done, and it is the final form of the translation. And it reads as follows. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This Word was with God in the beginning. Through him everything came into existence, and apart from him not one thing has existed that came into being. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. The light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness has not understood it. Amen. Okay, so that was from John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Now, if you have a Bible handy with you, you can do a quick comparison. This translation that is on display here, it should be very similar to many major English translations out there. Some things might be different. For example, let's take a look at verse 3. I use the words existence, existed, or being, right? These don't have to be used. Some translations substitute these words for words like created or made. It's no big deal. This is completely fine. However, looking at various variables, considerations, I don't know if created or made would be the most ideal words to use. So the English verb to exist is probably most accurate, right? For instance, when we consider John's broad audience, which consisted of Jews, Samaritans, and Gentiles, pretty much everyone, right? And when we're thinking about, ontology and Christology, especially when applied to Jesus, right? Jesus as being pre-existent, eternal, everlasting. Jesus as being God, the Logos, words related to creative acts, such as creating or making the world, these are presupposed. So I didn't use these words explicitly, but these are implied. All right. Especially when we're looking at the next verse, verse 4, where it mentions life and light, right? So these were, if you're looking at Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? He also created light and life. So this verse 4 of John's Gospel, chapter 1, it's a throwback to the account of creation found in the beginning of Genesis, right? So, taking these relationships into account, between the Bible, the Johannine text, Hellenistic culture, taking all these things into account, my reasoning for using, existence, verbs to exist, to be, instead of words like create or made, is because of, cultural, historical, and literary considerations. These cannot be ignored. So, translation work, it must be stated that it's not simply, you know, just transferring meaning literally between one word to the next. It's an organic process. It's an intellectual and spiritual process that encompasses a range of dimensions that is not merely confined to linguistics, to language alone. Anyways, the alien text, alien to you probably, below that is the Greek from John chapter 1 verse 3. This is taken from the Greek New Testament 5. And below that Greek text is my own initial literal translation into English, right? If it can even be called English at that. It's there only for reference, by the way. And if you're wondering what those brackets are, that are around phrases such as came into, from, or that came into, these brackets refer to implied meanings, right? Implied meanings that are not explicitly expressed. And by the way, implied meanings are characteristic of any language, right? This phenomena is present in all languages. So there's really no need to, fret about it, because, oh, there's that word that doesn't originally appear in the Greek or Hebrew text, right? So, for those people who say, well, the Bible in the original languages don't have this and that word, right? These are made up by English innovators. Well, the thing I want to say is, number one, like many things in life, translation work operates under certain conditions. There are limitations. And number two, meaning must have priority. Words alone are gibberish, basically, if they are devoid of meaning. And because no two languages are like for like, if you are this type of person I just described, I suggest that you do yourself a favor and learn the biblical languages, like Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So either way, because my translation philosophy, it lies somewhere in the middle between literal and idiomatic. What I mean by idiomatic is that it sounds more natural. It focuses on meaning, right? And so while I try to be as literal as much as possible, I break from this literal method when, the translation, when it results into something, too stiff or weird sounding. So, when being too literal obscures the meaning, I tend to, stay away from that. In other words, the translation philosophy I use aims at a balance, between literal and idiomatic intended meanings. So that's why I'm kind of showing you the Greek and my literal translation. I'm using this example to illustrate that while a purely literal translation is ideal at times, often that's not the case. Imagine reading this verse at church to a friend, whatever. Something like, all through him being, and apart him being not one being, right? This doesn't sound very appealing, does it? Nor is it is the meaning very discernible. Communication is always at play, and when it becomes an issue, it might affect the witness. All right. And imagine the problems you'd run into with Hebrew poetry, such as Psalms and Song of Songs, right? And like I mentioned, good luck trying to evangelize someone with this unusual language. They probably just look at you funny, like if you were kind of crazy. Maybe they'd think you're a cultist or some foreigner. Let's avoid that. So, yeah. This was a very brief, introduction to the prologue, this immensely important section of John's book. And I also included a note on my translation philosophy. Starting next time, a proper sermon, is in order, covering the first 5 verses of this opening section. And for those interested in further study, I've provided a list of sources related to today's topic. And below that is a copyright, for the single Greek verse that I used from the Greek New Testament 5. And at the very bottom in red is a translation disclaimer, because I don't want to get into, any trouble. So I think that's about it. Hopefully it was useful to somebody somewhere out there. Thank you again for sharing this time with me. And as always, take care. Have a blessed week, and God bless.